happened here in the taxi recently. And he told me that a man had got into his taxi and asked him to drive him to the harbour, which the taxi driver did. And then the man asked him how much he owed him, and he paid him. And then the man said, "I'm going to now jump into the harbour and commit suicide." And the taxi driver said, "I had a central locking system in the car, so I put it on. And I said to the man, 'No, you're not. You're going to sit here and talk to me.'" And the man told him that 2 weeks before his wife had died of cancer, and a week later his eldest son was killed in a car crash. And the taxi driver said to me, "I spoke with him for 2 hours, and at the end of the 2 hours the man said, 'Please drive me home.'" And so with all my training, I could not have done as well as he did. And he knew nothing, he'd done no training, but to me, a most excellent piece of therapeutic work that he did out of his own sort of voluntary heart, as it were. So it's just an example of what can occur between two persons. I was very struck, though, by that encounter. I remember when I got to the hotel and he helped me out with the luggage, he did say to me, "I don't think every taxi driver would have done that." And I'm sure he was right. So if one thinks of psychoanalysis as an opening of the mind, not only to itself, but to the universe in which the self is embedded, in such a way that the other is a mirror that gives knowledge of one's own inner and outer reality, then the classic picture of the analyst seeing someone on the couch for 50 minutes, 5 days a week, is only one particular instance of a principle which has many other forms. The substance of psychoanalysis has many ways in which it can be experienced, but the way psychoanalysis is often spoken about in seminars and for students and the IPA and the EPF for what constitutes minimum standards, the question of the couch is very nearly always introduced, for instance, and usually with an imperative that the patient should be invited to use it. Also, in IPA deliberations, the question of how many times a week constitutes an analysis is a subject often for ardent discussion and sometimes acrimonious. 5 times a week, 4 times a week, 3 times a week, these 3 options are usually accepted, though there is a reluctance to accept 3 times a week by many people. When someone said, "Why not twice a week?" a prominent psychoanalyst riposted that this was just mocking, though 3 times a week seemed acceptable to him. So this seems to me is how psychoanalysis is often thought about, and its practice is based upon that mode of definition. And we're all familiar with sort of cartoons which depict a patient on the couch and the analyst sitting behind with some humorous legend underneath. But all this is the outer clothing. It is in one particular form in which psychoanalysis manifests itself, and it's secondary but not primary. So I just want to say something about, to sort of elaborate a bit about what I think is the substance of a therapeutic encounter. I think that one has to posit that at the base of it there is a desire for contact with the other. And there's a desire for contact with the other, and therefore also the expansion and awareness of one's own mind. I don't know if any of you have read that book by Sati, the Scotsman, who wrote a book in 1937 called The Origins of Hate and Love. And he's, I think, probably the first person who said that the baby and the mother, it's not just nurture, that one of the primary things is the companionship that is desired. The second aspect of what I call the substance is that the desire is stimulated into life It's not caused. It's a strange way in which, that's why I said at the beginning that when my analyst John Klauber made that comment about removing an obstacle between the analyst and the patient, it had such an effect. And I have no doubt that it had the effect, one, from what it said, but I think much more that I knew this was something that he deeply felt. And this had the capacity to inspire and bring something out in me. It doesn't cause it. It's as though it comes entirely from within myself, and yet it's been stimulated into life through the, not even the words so much, but the inner sort of conviction of the other. Francis Thompson, that Catholic poet who wrote The Hound of Heaven, in an essay that he has on Coleridge, he talks about Coleridge inspiring other poets, and he makes the point, other poets did not copy him, but he inspired them. And so clearly Francis Thompson understood that way in which something can be stimulated into life through the sort of conviction of another. So, as I said before, I think it's one of the things that for me distinguishes prose from poetry. Poetry, and I sort of say this sort of advisedly, real poetry, because to me a lot of things that one reads that have the name of poetry are not poetry. But I think the difference really is that true poetry does actually stimulate one's own emotional imagination in a way that prose does not. And that's the way I would distinguish prose from poetry. Now, the question is, what if this desire for the other has not been satisfied? And I personally think probably it's so. I think one of the most interesting findings of the attachment theorists is that a mother who's able to reflect on her own experiences, even when these experiences have been bad or unfortunate, the baby is able to attach securely. I think actually attachment theorists are not right to call it attached securely. I think the baby is able to relate to the mother. But it's a very interesting thing to me that it's the mother's internal reflective processes that enable that in the baby. It's not that she's saying, I must do this in order to sort of nurture the baby. It's what one might call a natural inner reflective process that she has not even really been taught to do, that is enabling for the baby. But so what if this has not happened, and there's still the desire for the other is deeply sort of implanted in us? Then I think a substitute is produced, and the substitute is basically an attachment to one's own self, and that is used, as it were, as a substitute for what is really wanted. I associate myself with that of another. It's to me a very important thing, because it's to me tremendously important that someone, a therapist or an analyst, does not impose his own sort of view of life upon the patient, but really connects to the patient's and the patient's own problem. I think one of the slight signs, actually, of is this something really, truly happening that is beneficial for the patient is, am I as analyst changed by this encounter? And if I am changed, I think then there's quite a chance that the possibility that the patient will be. So the focus here is upon our understanding and not upon the instruments used to achieve that understanding. So in many a clinical paper, it would seem that the transference is the goal rather than an instrument we use to achieve the goal. And it's the same with all these other instruments: interpretation believed to be the agent of change, countertransference, projection, denial, repression, displacement, and so on. An astronomer needs to spend time to make sure that his telescope is properly set up, but the object of his research are the stars and the planets, which the telescope helps him to see better. These analytic instruments just mentioned are equivalents to the telescope, and the goal of psychoanalysis is to see the inner world of the two participants and to understand them. The telescope needs to be in good order so we can see clearly, but it is not the object of the exercise. So I gave you that example about George Eliot, and I'll give you now another one. In 1979, I was reading a series of essays by Isaiah Berlin that were published in his book, Against the Current. The focus in the essays in this book is upon those European thinkers who went against the tide, against the fashion of thought current at the time. One such thinker, whom he described